A newly appointed police chief returns to his hometown, determined to restore integrity to a corrupt department, but his efforts are met with hostility from within. During a late-night encounter, two racist officers mock his authority, unlawfully detain him, and humiliate him by tying him to a post in an isolated area. Their behavior, driven by arrogance and bigotry, escalates into a blatant abuse of power, leaving the chief abandoned in the cold night. However, this act of cruelty sets off a chain of events that forces the officers to confront the consequences of their actions. They tied him up cruelly, securing the ropes with merciless precision, and left him stranded on a barren, forgotten road. Tossed aside like worthless debris, they roared away in their vehicle, their laughter cutting through the stillness of the night like the twisted cry of jackals. To them, it was nothing more than a prank, a dark, perverse thrill they believed would never come back to haunt them. But they had underestimated the man they targeted. This isn't a tale of forgiveness or redemption. It's a reckoning, and to understand it, we must return to where it all began. David Langston, a 52-year-old former military officer recently sworn in as the new chief of police in his hometown, was a man on a mission. Known for his unyielding principles and unwavering discipline, David had come back to the very streets where he'd spent his childhood, determined to cleanse the department of its long-standing corruption and re-establish trust within the community. While his record as a man of honor and justice earned him respect in many quarters, not everyone welcomed the changes he vowed to bring. On a quiet evening, David drove home in his beat-up old pickup truck, wearing his favorite weathered green cap that bore the logo of his high school alma mater. He was deep in thought, running through his plans to introduce reforms and instill a stronger sense of accountability among his officers. The streets were eerily quiet, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows. Suddenly, the glare of headlights filled his rearview mirror. Assuming it was a routine matter, he slowed and pulled over, unaware that this encounter would mark a defining moment in his new role. Two officers emerged from the patrol car behind him. John Harrington, a towering man with a smug expression that hinted at unchecked authority, and his partner, Blake Turner, whose every movement oozed arrogance as he idly spun his baton in one hand. Despite David calmly identifying himself as the newly appointed chief, the two officers exuded a palpable air of disdain, mocking his authority as though it were a joke. What should have been a simple exchange spiraled into an unnecessary display of dominance and disrespect. "Good evening, officers. Is there something wrong?" David asked, his tone steady and professional as he rolled down his window. "Your taillight's busted," Harrington replied lazily, leaning heavily against the truck as though it belonged to him. David nodded, his expression unflinching. "Thanks for pointing it out. I'll get that fixed first thing." But Harrington wasn't interested in civility. "You're welcome," he said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Although, judging by this heap of junk you're driving, I doubt you've got the cash to take care of it anytime soon." Turner chuckled, spinning his baton more theatrically. "You sure you're the new chief? Doesn't seem like you'd make it past basic training, let alone lead this department." David's calm demeanor didn't waver, though his patience wore thin. "I can assure you I am," he replied firmly, "and as your superior, I expect professionalism." At that, Harrington's grin widened into something sinister. "Superior," he sneered. "The way I see it, you're just another guy behind the wheel of a busted-up truck." Turner leaned closer, peering into the cab as though sizing him up. "He's got the cap for it, though," he joked. "Real authoritative." The exchange might have ended there, but Harrington wasn't done. Fueled by a sense of impunity, he reached through the window, plucking the cap off David's head. "Doesn't suit you anyway," he said mockingly, tossing it onto the pavement. For a moment, David considered pushing back, but he knew better than to escalate the situation on the side of a deserted road. Instead, he took a slow breath, his sharp eyes locking onto Harrington's. "I'll be sure to remember this." "Sure thing, boss," Harrington replied, his words dripping with sarcasm as he stepped back. "Now why don't you drive on home before we find another reason to keep you here?" David didn't respond. He simply put his truck in gear and drove away, his mind already calculating his next move. What the two officers hadn't realized was that their actions had ignited a fire in the man they sought to humiliate. David Langston wasn't someone who let transgressions slide. He was a man who believed in consequences, and their behavior would soon bring theirs. "I'll handle this first thing tomorrow," David assured himself as he handed over his license and registration, fully compliant and expecting the stop to be over in minutes. But the situation took a bizarre and unnecessary turn. Turner circled the pickup truck, lazily tapping the metal frame with his baton, his voice laced with a false sense of suspicion. "You're pretty relaxed for a guy pulled over on an empty road," Turner jeered, his eyes narrowing as though studying David for a crack in his calm. "Got somewhere urgent to be, old man?" David met his gaze with a faint smile, his composure unwavering. "Just heading home after a long day. No rush." Recognizing the undercurrent of hostility, David decided it was time to clarify. "By the way, I'm the new chief of police," he said, his voice steady. "This has to be some kind of misunderstanding." The two officers exchanged a look, their expressions shifting from feigned professionalism to open mockery before they broke into laughter. "Chief of police?" Harrington said with a scoff. "That's a good one. Next thing you'll tell us you're running for governor," Turner added, shaking his head as though the very idea was absurd. What had started as a traffic stop devolved further into a spectacle of humiliation. Despite David's full compliance and measured responses, it was clear the officers were more interested in flexing their authority than in following procedure. Harrington leaned closer to the truck, his grin widening into a predator's smirk. "Why don't you step out of the vehicle?" Harrington said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Let's make sure everything checks out." David's brow furrowed slightly, but he remained calm. "I've already provided my license and registration. There's no need for this." Harrington's smirk twisted into something darker. "Is that so? You questioning protocol now. You've got two options. Step out, or we'll help you out." Realizing he had little choice if he wanted to avoid escalating the encounter further, David unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the truck. He stood tall, meeting their hostility with quiet resolve. But before he could say another word, Turner moved swiftly behind him, gripping his arms and yanking them back with unnecessary force. "Whoa, what's this about?" David asked, his voice level but firm. "Just doing our due diligence," Turner sneered as he slapped the handcuffs onto David's wrists, the metal biting into his skin. As Turner secured the cuffs, Harrington took it upon himself to rifle through David's truck. Without explanation, he began tossing its contents onto the ground. A bag of groceries spilled its contents across the dirt. A worn jacket landed in a heap. Finally, Harrington pulled out David's old battered green cap, the one he wore almost daily. "Holding it up like a prize," Harrington sneered. "Well, look at this," he said mockingly. "Big patriot over here. Guess you think wearing this makes you special, huh, untouchable?" David's jaw tightened as he watched his belongings discarded carelessly. His patience, already stretched thin, was wearing dangerously close to the breaking point. "You're making a mistake," David said, his voice carrying the weight of restrained anger. His sharp gaze met Harrington's, refusing to waver. But rather than take heed, Harrington merely chuckled. Turner, too, tightened his grip on David's arms, leaning closer as if to relish his control over the situation. David knew this was no longer about a broken taillight or any semblance of protocol. This was a power play, and they were pushing their limits, testing how far they could go. But what they didn't understand was that the man standing before them had already begun calculating his next move. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cuffs bit into David's wrists as Turner tightened them unnecessarily, his smirk broadening. "What's the plan, Chief?" Turner taunted. "Gonna write us a strongly worded memo?" Both officers continued their mockery as they rifled through David's truck, their arrogance on full display. Harrington tossed the old green cap back into the cab with a flick of his wrist, his expression dripping with disdain. "Relax, old man," he said with exaggerated casualness. "We're just doing our jobs." David stayed silent, knowing that engaging with their provocations would only fuel their egos. It was clear this wasn't about a busted taillight anymore. These men weren't interested in enforcing the law. They wanted a victim, and tonight, that victim was him. The night darkened as Harrington and Turner escalated their abuse. The patrol car jolting down a bumpy dirt road. Far from the main highway, David, handcuffed and sitting silently in the back seat, stayed calm but alert. The dense forest outside pressed in, the trees forming a wall of shadows as the car rumbled deeper into isolation. David's sharp mind was already working, analyzing every move, planning his response. The car skidded to a stop in a remote clearing, the sound of the engine cutting through the stillness. Harrington climbed out first, yanking the back door open with a mocking grin. "All right, old-timer, time to stretch your legs," he said, dragging David out of the vehicle. Turner followed, pulling a length of frayed rope from the trunk and letting it uncoil dramatically. "This is going to be one hell of a first-day story for you, huh, Chief?" he sneered, shaking his head. David straightened, his composure unbroken despite the deepening hostility. "This is unnecessary," he said firmly, looking between the two men. "If you've got an issue with me, let's deal with it back at the station." Harrington let out a loud, theatrical laugh. "Oh, we'll get there," he said, his tone mocking. "But first, you need to learn how things really work around here." Turner approached, his grin widening. "Yeah, boss, welcome to the team," he said sarcastically, tightening the rope around David's arms and chest. The coarse fibers bit into David's jacket as they secured him to an old, rusted metal post, likely left behind from some forgotten roadside project. David's muscles strained against the restraints, but he remained outwardly calm. His steady gaze never left his tormentors, even as Harrington plucked the discarded green cap from the ground. Spinning it on his finger, Harrington smirked before slapping it onto his own head at an awkward angle. "How do I look?" he asked, turning to Turner with a laugh. "Pretty patriotic, right?" David's voice was cold and deliberate. "This is your last chance to end this now. Let me go, and I might consider being lenient." Harrington barked out another laugh, pulling out his phone. "Don't worry, Chief," he said mockingly. "We'll let you go eventually." He snapped a picture, the flash momentarily illuminating the smug satisfaction on his face. Moments later, the patrol car roared back to life. The officers climbed in, their laughter echoing as they sped away, leaving David bound to the post in the freezing night air. Alone in the clearing, surrounded by dense trees, David tested the ropes. They held firm. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He'd endured worse in his life, and he wasn't about to let these men break him. Instead, he focused on his breathing and the next steps. This wasn't the end. It was a challenge, one he intended to overcome. The hours dragged on, the cold sinking into his bones as he remained tied to the post. His arms ached, his body stiffened, but his resolve never faltered. The eerie quiet of the forest was broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, faintly, he heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. A beam of light bobbed through the trees, growing brighter as it neared. A wiry man, in a weathered flannel jacket and scuffed boots, stepped into the clearing, holding a flashlight. His face, lined with age and concern, twisted into disbelief when he saw David. "What in tarnation?" the man muttered, lowering the beam as he approached. "What happened to you?" David squinted against the light, his voice steady despite the hours of discomfort. "It's a long story, but I'd appreciate it if you could cut me loose." The man set down the flashlight and pulled a pocket knife from his jacket. "Whoever did this to you ought to be ashamed of themselves," he said, his tone heavy with disapproval, as he worked through the ropes with practiced efficiency. Within moments, David was free. He stumbled forward, catching himself against the post as blood rushed back into his arms and legs. He flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders to regain feeling. "Thank you," David said, his voice sincere. "You don't know how much I appreciate this." The man studied him, concern still etched into his features. "You sure you're all right? You look like you've been through hell." David nodded firmly. "I'll live, but I need to get back to the station. There's some business I need to settle." "Station?" the man asked, his brows lifting in surprise. "Wait, you mean cops did this to you? What the hell is going on?" David's tone was measured but resolute. "It's complicated, but trust me, they won't get away with it." The man shook his head in disbelief but didn't press further. "My truck's parked not far from here. Let me give you a lift. No way you're walking these roads tonight." After a brief hesitation, David nodded. "I appreciate it." The ride back to the station was quiet, the hum of the truck's engine filling the air. David stared out the window, his mind racing as he formulated his plan. By the time they pulled into the station parking lot, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Once inside his office, David retrieved the memory card from his truck's dash cam and slid it into his laptop. As the footage played, illuminating his face in flickering light, his jaw clenched, his hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the determination flooding through him. The actions of Harrington and Turner would not go unanswered. The footage captured everything. Every smirk, every sarcastic comment, every abuse of power by officers John Harrington and Blake Turner. The video began with their mocking dismissal of David Langston's credentials and escalated to their threats and unnecessary cruelty. Their taunts were clear, audible, and damning, showcasing their intent to teach him a lesson. The camera didn't miss a thing. The unwarranted handcuffing, their invasive rummaging through his truck, and finally, the humiliating scene where they tied him to the rusted post and left him stranded. David sat back in his office chair, his eyes locked on the screen as he replayed the footage. This wasn't just evidence. It was incontrovertible proof. Proof of their misconduct, their arrogance, and their belief that they were untouchable. But they had made a grave miscalculation. They had underestimated him, and now David held the power to ensure their actions would have real consequences. The next morning, Harrington and Turner lounged in the precinct's break room, sipping coffee and laughing as they recounted the events of the previous night. To them, it was just another conquest, another warped tale to bolster their ego-driven camaraderie. "You should have seen his face," Harrington said with a smug grin, leaning back in his chair. "Tied up like that, he looked ready to cry, absolutely priceless." Turner chuckled, stirring his coffee with exaggerated nonchalance. "And the way he kept going on about being the new chief like we were actually going to buy that crap, what a joke." Their laughter echoed in the room, but it came to an abrupt halt when the door swung open. David Langston stepped inside, dressed sharply in a crisp suit, exuding a calm yet commanding authority. The man before them was a far cry from the one they had mocked and left humiliated the night before. His expression was steely, his gaze cold and resolute. "Good morning, gentlemen," David said, his tone sharp as a blade. Harrington froze mid-sip, his coffee cup slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. Turner's hand trembled, his spoon clattering against the rim of his mug. They both knew instantly that the tables had turned. Without waiting for a response, David set a folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed stills from the dashcam footage, images of their smirking faces, their mocking gestures, and the degrading scene they had orchestrated. Each photo was a vivid reminder of their actions. "You see these?" David said, tapping the images. "These aren't just pictures. They're evidence of misconduct, abuse of power, and a complete failure to uphold the oath you swore to this department and this community." Harrington and Turner fumbled for excuses, their words tumbling over each other incoherently. But David silenced them with a raised hand. "Save it," he said coldly. "I've already forwarded the footage to Internal Affairs, the district attorney, and the mayor's office. You have 5 minutes to hand over your badges and clean out your lockers. Consider yourselves fortunate. I'm not having you arrested right here, right now." Humbled and defeated, the two officers shuffled out of the room. Their once overbearing arrogance had crumbled into shame. The precinct fell silent as their colleagues watched them leave, their disgrace etched into every bowed step. David, now firmly in control, turned to address the other officers who had gathered outside the break room, their faces a mixture of shock and admiration. He spoke with unwavering conviction, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "Let this serve as a lesson," he began. "Corruption, abuse of power, and anything less than the highest standards of integrity will not be tolerated in this department. If you can't meet those standards, there's the door." The officers stood straighter, the gravity of his words sinking in. They were witnessing not just a disciplinary action, but the dawn of a new era. For years, the department had languished under a culture of complacency and corruption. Today, David Langston had drawn a definitive line in the sand. True to his word, David ensured the evidence was delivered to the appropriate authorities. The dashcam footage, both video and audio, left no room for doubt. It was more than just an internal matter. It was a public statement of accountability and transparency. He wanted the community to see that the department was changing and that trust could be rebuilt. As Harrington and Turner left the precinct, their badges and pride discarded, a heavy silence lingered. Slowly, it was broken by the sound of applause. It began with a few officers and grew, a ripple of acknowledgement for the courage and leadership David had displayed. David turned to face them, his expression firm but resolute. "This is a turning point for our department," he said. "We will operate with respect, accountability, and unwavering integrity. Anything less will not be accepted." The officers nodded, their respect for him clear. David's actions had sent a powerful message. The culture of impunity was over, and a new standard had been set. The department felt a shift, a renewed sense of purpose and hope. As David watched the precinct settle back into its rhythm, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. This ordeal had tested his resolve, but it had also solidified his vision for the department. Leadership wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about setting an example, standing firm in the face of adversity, and demanding better from those who served alongside you. This wasn't just the end of Harrington and Turner's reign of abuse. It was the beginning of something greater. A department built on justice, fairness, and honor.